Mr. Deputy Speaker, President Halima Yaakob took her oath of office on 14th September 2017. President Halima is a popular figure who is well respected in many circles. She was also my former Member of Parliament who worked hard to serve her constituents. Yet, despite her personal attributes, the lightning circumstances under which this government installed her as the head of state have left Singaporeans reeling in its wake. In the immediate aftermath of announcing this year's presidential election as reserved for Malay candidates, the media reports highlighted how the public embraced the move with open arms, welcoming a Malay president after a break of 46 years. Yet, as the dust started to settle, it was clear that the public was very divided over this issue. At public discussion forums, such as the one organized by the Institute of Public Policy Studies on 8 September, law professors and retired politicians raised legal issues and shared adverse public opinions on the matter. Social media exploded in critique and satire. Indeed, in the past few days, it seems to me that the top government leaders have been going into overdrive, trying hard to convince Singaporeans that the elected presidency is an integral pillar of Singapore's commitment to multiracialism. The government now appears to be well aware of the unhappiness on the ground caused by its maneuvers to install President Halima. Sir, this motion does not seek to deal with the wider issues of the presidency, nor multiracialism, which are worthy of much longer airtime. Neither is it my purpose to go into the legal arguments, some of which have been aired in our courts in July. This motion focuses on the parliamentary debates and only one aspect of those debates. What did the government tell Parliament was the basis for counting reserved presidential elections under the hiatus-triggered model, and was what the government told Parliament accurate? To cut to the chase, did the Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister Teo Chee Hean, and Minister Chan Chun Sing make misleading statements to the House that the question of which president to count from was a legal question? Did the government all along make a policy decision itself to count from President Wee Kim Wee? Did the government merely use the AGC's advice as a cover to avoid full parliamentary debate on why the count was not starting from President Ong Teng Cheong? To answer this question, it is necessary to start with what happened in November during the debate on the Constitution Amendment Bill. During that debate on 8th November, the Prime Minister told the House the following, and I quote, "The symbolic role of the President is just as important as his custodial role. As a symbol of the nation, the race of the candidate is relevant. So, while individually a good candidate of any race will be satisfactory, collectively, over a period of time, we need that mix of presidents of different races, and the election mechanism must be designed to produce such a mix over time. This is what the hiatus-triggered model delivers." When should the racial provisions start counting? The Constitutional Amendment Bill states that the government should legislate on this point. The government intends to legislate when we amend the Presidential Elections Act in January next year. We have taken the Attorney General's advice. We will start counting from the first president who exercised the powers of the elected president, in other words, Dr. Wee Kim Wee. That means we are now in the 5th term of the elected presidency. Therefore, by the operation of the hiatus-triggered model, the next election, due next year, 2017, will be a reserved election for Malay candidates. That was the Prime Minister's speech, unquote. Sir, the clear impression given to members was that the government's decision to count from President Wee Kim Wee was based on the AGC's advice. That must have been why the Prime Minister sequenced the sentences as he did, that, having taken the AGC's advice, the government was counting the 5 terms from President Wee Kim Wee. The Prime Minister did not say that the government intended to count from President Wee Kim Wee and that the AGC had merely confirmed that it was acceptable to do so. Sir, it seems that the media had a similar impression. In a Channel News Asia report on 8 November 2016, there was a headline which read as follows, reporting on the debate, and I quote, "Next presidential election to be reserved for Malay candidates. PM Lee says the government has taken the Attorney General's advice that racial provisions in the review of the elected presidency will start counting from Dr. Wee Kim Wee." That was the headline. The impression that it was the AGC who advised the government to count from President Wee was perpetuated the next day, 9th November, by DPM Teo Chee Hian. During clarification time, I rose to expressly recall that the PM had said that the decision to count from Dr. Wee Kim Wee was based on the Attorney General's Chamber's advice on how to count the terms. I asked whether the government was prepared to publish that advice. DPM Teo did not reply immediately. After a cabinet huddle, DPM Teo eventually rose and responded as follows. "On the reserve elections and how to count, I would like to confirm that this is indeed the Attorney General's Chamber's advice. And if not, and you do not think that is correct, I think it is possible if you wish to challenge judicially." Let me repeat what he said. "On the reserve elections and how to count, I would like to confirm that this is indeed the Attorney General's Chamber's advice. And if not, and you do not think that is correct, I think it's possible if you wish to challenge judicially." Unquote. Deputy Speaker, sir, any reasonable person hearing those words would assume the following. 1, that the AGC had advised the government how to count. 2, that the AGC's advice involved a question of law. Why else would I be asked to challenge it judicially? As the debate went on, I was asked whether I was suggesting that the PM had falsely told the House that such was the advice of the AGC. I repeated that my interest was in asking for the AGC's advice to be published. DPM Teo then told the House that he would ask the Prime Minister to consider publishing the advice. 3 months later, on 6 February, this House held the second reading debate on the Presidential Elections Amendment Bill. What struck me in preparing for the debate was that the bill contained a new schedule with a table stipulating that the count was to start from President Wee Kim Wee. It dawned on me then that the government had simply wanted Parliament to make new law to stipulate that the count should start from President Wee Kim Wee. It was completely a government decision. When I put it to the government that counting from President Wee Kim Wee was an arbitrary and deliberate decision to achieve a desired outcome, Minister Chan Chun Sing rejected my assertion. He told the House that the government had decided not to publish the AGC's advice. Minister Chan further said, quote, "The government is confident of the advice rendered by the Attorney General. We proceeded on that basis during the debates on the constitutional changes in this House. Prime Minister Lee explained to all why we needed the hiatus-triggered mechanism, and we passed the Constitution Amendment Bill. We are here today to put the nuts and bolts in place for a decision made clear by the Prime Minister during the debates in November, and we will not go through this again." He continued, "Ms. Lim once again questioned the Attorney General's advice. I'm a bit bewildered by this. I would like to clarify. A, is Ms. Lim suggesting that the Attorney General did not give the government the appropriate advice? Or B, that the Prime Minister has not been truthful with the Attorney General's advice? If it is the first, then I think Ms. Lim, as suggested by Deputy Prime Minister Teo, can challenge this in the courts. But if it is the second, then I'm afraid it is a very serious issue to cast aspersions on the integrity of our Prime Minister." Unquote. So we should note what happened here. Instead of confirming that it was the government who made the decision to count from President Wee, Minister Chan explicitly said that the government was confident of the AGC's advice and proceeded on that basis to make the constitutional changes. He said he did not want to reopen the debate on the count from President Wee, even though Parliament was then asked for the first time to enact the table stipulating the count from President Wee. Here we were debating a law that would practically rewrite history by deeming President Wee as the first elected president. Yet, instead of the government using the opportunity to clarify the matter and any misimpressions created, it chose instead to impute sinister intentions to me. And that was how the parliamentary debates on the reserved presidential elections ended. So, with this background, we now turn to what happened next in the court proceedings brought by former presidential election candidate Dr. Tan Cheng Bock. In High Court Originating Summons number 495 of 2017, Dr. Tan sought a declaration from the court that the amendment to the Presidential Elections Act in February to count from President Wee Kim Wee was unconstitutional. In other words, his case was that Parliament had passed an unconstitutional law in February when it legislated the schedule to the Presidential Elections Act with the table to count the hiatus from President Wee. Sir, prior to commencing his case, Dr. Tan had obtained the opinion of a prominent Queen's Counsel in London, considered an expert on Westminster model constitutional law. The advice received was that Parliament's amendment to the Presidential Elections Act to count reserved presidential elections from Dr. Wee Kim Wee was unconstitutional. The basis for this opinion was that one had to read the Constitution in a purposive manner. That is, the Constitution should be interpreted in a way that furthers its purpose. Since the purpose of the constitutional amendment was to cure the problem of 5 presidential elections not turning out a candidate from a particular ethnic community, counting from President Wee did not make sense, since he was never elected. This would mean that it was proper to count only from President Ong Teng Cheong or later. If that were to be done, this year's presidential election would still be open to candidates of all communities. Sir, although Dr. Tan's case has now been dismissed by the Court of Appeal, what is most telling is the stand taken by the AGC in the case. Deputy Attorney General Mr. Hari Kumar, a former PAP MP, represented the government. He made the following submissions to the court. Before the High Court on 29 June 2017, the Deputy AG said, and I quote, "The Prime Minister never said that the AG advised PM to start the count from President Wee. What PM said is that the AG advised that what the government was proposing to do was legitimate." This is from the official court transcript. Mr. Kumar further submitted that the decision on which president to count from was a policy matter for the government and not a legal question. He argued, and I quote, "The AG was in no position to tell the government where to start the count from," unquote. On 31st July, before the Court of Appeal of 5 judges, the Deputy AG repeated his position even more vividly. He submitted that the AGC's advice was irrelevant. He also tried to explain away the PM's speech on taking the AGC's advice. He said, and I quote, "One should not look at speeches like statutory instruments. The PM had made it clear from his speech that President Wee was not a popularly elected president, but a president who exercised the powers of an elected president. Then he says, 5th term of elected president, a convenient term used in his speech. He wasn't defining presidency in this context as elected presidency." That was Mr. Nair's submission to the court. Sir, I was in court when he made that submission, which to me was astonishing. Was the Deputy Attorney General saying that we should not take the PM's speech literally, but loosely, not place too much weight on the terms PM used in making a keynote speech to Parliament to amend the Constitution. Indeed, the Deputy AG's submission that the Prime Minister would use terms for convenience drew some skepticism from one of the judges, who remarked from the bench that the Prime Minister was speaking in a parliamentary debate and would not refer to the elected President for ease of convenience. Deputy Speaker, sir, the government's reference to the AGC's advice has confused MPs and also the courts. The ministers kept consistently referring to the AGC's advice as the basis for the legislative changes. Yet, the Deputy AG says in court that the advice is irrelevant. I would like all parties interested to look at the court transcripts to see how the court struggled with trying to make sense of what the government was saying in Parliament with regard to the AGC's advice. Deputy Speaker, the mysterious AGC's advice has still not been produced before Parliament nor the courts. I can only assume that revealing the advice would not be useful to the government. Even if one were to give the benefit of the doubt to the Prime Minister, to assume that the PM's speech in November was just ambiguous rather than misleading, it is also deeply troubling that nobody from the front bench sought to correct the impression given. The ministers must have known that the House understood that the government was acting on the AGC's advice on how to count, that there were legal questions involved. Yet, nobody came out to clarify that, hey, actually, it was the government who decided to count from week in week. It was a policy decision. Nevertheless, we sought the AGC's blessing to cover ourselves. This was never told to us. So as things stand, the courts have now decided that which president to count from for the reserved presidential election is indeed a policy decision for Parliament. The government's handling of the parliamentary debates on the legislative changes for a reserved presidential election has been most unsatisfactory. Here we are, debating changes affecting the highest office in the land, yet the government decides to engage in ambiguous language and red herrings. We in this House should have been told in no uncertain terms that it was the government that wanted to count from week in week. The government should have defended its own decision on why counting from President Wee was appropriate. It should not have evaded the debate by using the AGC's advice as a distraction and then gone to court to say that the AGC's advice was irrelevant. Sir, with the benefit of the additional knowledge from the court case, I now think back of the parliamentary debates when the government refused to publish the AGC's advice despite repeated requests. Did the government refuse to publish the advice because doing so would have made it clear that the decision to count from President Wee was initiated by the government and the government alone? So, be that as it may, the Deputy AG has now told us that the AGC's advice was merely sought to legitimize what the government itself wanted to do. Sir, the government should have told Parliament directly that counting from President Wee was its decision and defended the decision on the merits. Instead, it chose to distract and confuse. The government's inconsistent explanations would further fuel the suspicions of Singaporeans about the real intention behind the legislative changes that resulted in this year's presidential election being a closed one.